right. Well, we are here now for the National Roundtable. It'll go for about an hour. It'll go an hour and a half. I'll probably stop at about the hour so we can really do a lot more Q&A with the audience. We've got a great group here. I'm going to let each person introduce themselves. But, you know, when I was first talking about, you know, in Denver, we were the first to start sales, but right after us, hot on our heels, was some other jurisdictions. And these are some of the leaders from some of the great jurisdictions that really have a good handle on the way they're regulating marijuana. And I'll sit in the middle. I'm going to be moderating and asking a few questions. But I'll go ahead and take a seat. And Darcy, could you please introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Darcy Edel-By-Herd. I am the Business License Section Manager and Management Marijuana Program Coordinator for the City of Las Vegas. I don't know what else you want to know.
Good morning. My name is Joe Devlin. I'm with the City of Sacramento. I'm the city's Chief of Cannabis Policy and Enforcement. Did you want us to go in a little bit about?
Sure. Why don't you talk about how many licenses you have?
Our entry into cannabis regulation began in 2010 with the adoption of a voter-approved sales tax or gross receipts tax on cannabis businesses. At that time, we had approximately 54 dispensaries and created like a process for them to become permitted. 30 of those made it through the process. We've had 30 dispensaries since that time. We currently have a completed regulatory framework for all of cannabis, and we've begun taking applications and issuing permits for cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, as well as testing labs in addition to our retail permits. We are currently in the middle of processing approximately 300 different applications.
Darcy, did you want to follow up? Yeah, sure. Hi, Darcy again. Okay, so City of Las Vegas, we started taking medical marijuana applications in 2014. The state, by population, allocated a certain number to all the different jurisdictions, so the city was allocated 12 dispensaries. There was no limit on the number of cultivation and production. It took probably 2 years to get them all up and running, but we do have all 12 dispensaries operating and licensed. We had one cultivation facility that ended up having to close down due to our construction, and he was looking for a new location. And then we do have a couple of new cultivation facilities that have started the process again, 1 production facility and 4 testing labs. Recreational marijuana started in July of last year, and all of our 12 dispensaries have the dual components to that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kat Packer. I'm the Executive Director of the Department of Cannabis Regulation for the City of Los Angeles. The City of Los Angeles has about 4 million people, so approximately maybe even the same size of the state of Colorado in terms of population. The City of Los Angeles just began to license and regulate commercial cannabis activity at the beginning of this year. We had a system and framework that allowed for certain medical operators to have limited immunity from prosecution. So we never actually authorized medical businesses to operate, but certain medical businesses that had paid taxes in past years and maybe had registered were able to escape prosecution in past years, but we just began to license and regulate both medical and adult use at the beginning of this year. We currently have 169 locations that are authorized to engage in both medical and adult use retail sales. We were giving these businesses the ability to vertically integrate, so these 169 retail operators are also able to cultivate, manufacture, and distribute. We have a phased licensing process, so we've just kind of concluded accepting applications for our second phase of licensing, and that was an intention to bring on the existing retail market supply chain. One of our council members liked to say that the City of Los Angeles had a cannabis immaculate conception issue because we had authorized all of these retail locations but never really quite knew where the cannabis was coming from. What this has meant is that the past 10 months we have really been focused on trying to transition our previously existing market and have not opened up our licensure process for new businesses in the city.
Hey, I'm Brandon Goldner. I'm the program coordinator and supervisor of the City of Portland, Oregon's cannabis program. And really good to see all of you here. Thrilled to be here, and thank you to Ashley and the City of Denver for hosting. I've been here 3 times now, starting in 2015, which is when our program was created. Oregon voters approved recreational cannabis in 2014. Our program began in 2015. We started licensing medical dispensaries in late 2015. Recreational businesses came online in early 2017. And as of right now, the City of Portland has 300 active licensees. 150 of those are retailers, and then about 50 are wholesalers, 50 are processors, and 50 are producers. That's what it looks like right now.
Great. Well, I'll start with the initial question and toss it over to this side of the table. Darcy and Joe, what were some initial assumptions that you had about what this would look like? What were some of those initial assumptions, and did they prove to be true or not true?
So I think a lot of us were really concerned that we were going to see marijuana, flowing in the streets and people high all the time, and it was just going to be completely chaos. And of course, that isn't really the case. Some of the assumptions we did have also was it was going to be a problem with the odor, and with the cultivation facilities, seeping out into the communities, being too close to neighborhoods. So we put in some really strict land use regulations to try and keep them away from the residents. And in the city, I think it actually worked out pretty good because we kept those guys in like the industrial area, and they weren't anywhere near the neighborhoods. And I know in other parts of Southern Nevada, the odor has been a problem.
And when you talk about odor, are you talking about odor from cultivation or odor from public consumption?
Odor from the cultivation facilities, being that it's still not legal to consume in public, it's a misdemeanor. That really hasn't been too bad of a problem, not any more than it was before. And so that was one of the misconceptions, that it was going to be flowing in the streets and you were just going to, crash into it every 5 seconds, but it really hasn't been that.
And so following up on that, have the rest of you been surprised or not surprised about the level of public consumption that you're seeing in your streets?
Well, for Sacramento, that really, I don't think we've really seen a big uptick in that. I mean, we've had an element of it, and to begin with, one of my assumptions was that we already had a cannabis industry to a degree. We already had cannabis in our community it never really went away. But we made lots of assumptions around cost, around staff time, around how much time it's going to take to do X, Y, and Z, and we were not accurate, but we were in the ballpark. And so what we've had to do is go back and change a lot of those assumptions. We also made assumptions around impacts, and we began with kind of, I think, the general assumption that this was going to have a lot of negative impacts. And while what we have learned, I think, is that particularly around like cultivation, there are issues around odor. It's just difficult to contain all of it. And so there are land use decisions become important, and we got some of those more right. We also had some lessons learned that the retail portions of this were not necessarily so land use sensitive that they need to be sequestered off into industrial parts of the cities. Now, we wrote our code that way, but we also grandfathered in our 30 dispensaries, and that allowed us to have an experience that we couldn't have planned for. And so while the rules said you had to be off into these 2 corners of the city, more or less, our dispensaries were essentially spread out across the city, including near schools, including near parks, and including in, quote unquote, nice neighborhoods, and they were not problematic. And so some of those assumptions have, I think, not come to fruition.
And so I'd love to hear from you guys, that same public consumption question, are people smoking in the street and high in the street? And also that issue that I think both Joe and Darcy touched on. Were you surprised by the LOE, the level of effort and resources taken to do this, required to do this?
So I think that I would echo what Joe said about the assumptions along infrastructure and timeline and how much staff we would need. When the City of Los Angeles first created a Department of Cannabis Regulation back in 2017, it did so before we had developed rules and regulations. So we had created a team before we knew exactly what the team was going to be responsible for. At the same time, we were waiting for the state of California to develop its regulations. And so when the department was first created, we were created as a department of 5. For the first 4 months, it was just me in the Department of Cannabis Regulation, so folks would be surprised. You'd call the department and I'd answer the phone, and it was kind of difficult to get work done that way because we had a lot of interest in the city of Los Angeles. In terms of staffing, we've recognized that we were going to need a lot more positions to do what the rules and regulations actually required us to do. So we went from having 5 positions to 10 months later being allocated for a total of 28 positions. We have 11 of those positions filled, and this is for folks doing licensing and compliance, public outreach and communications, just even tracking the policy. And I think one of the other assumptions I think that I had when we first started was that I assumed that there would be some sense of stability over the course of the first 12 months of this implementation, but we've seen the state of California at this point is still operating under emergency regulations. There have been 4 different iterations of what our commercial framework has looked like. Every single time the state of California changes its framework, we have to reevaluate what our local framework looks like. We'll address the public consumption issue. The city of cannabis is no stranger to the city of Los Angeles. I think what has surprised me the most is that we still have kind of flagrant commercial consumption that I'm starting to see pop up. I was reading an LA Weekly article where they were doing a profile on a cannabis where folks could tour and kind of hotbox this bus and roll around the city, and I thought that was surprising because that is illegal. But it's being profiled in this widely read magazine, and so there's a lot going on in terms of cannabis activity in the city. There are things that kind of surprise me every single day. I didn't know that kind of dealing with technology platforms and folks that illegally advertise illegal businesses would be such a big issue, but that's been a huge issue. But lots of challenges to deal with in this first 12 to 14 months.
Yeah, plenty of assumptions we made, some of which were accurate, some were not. Mentioned earlier the potential deleterious effects that retailers would have on neighborhoods. That is not something that we have seen. In fact, quite the opposite. From infrastructure improvements to increased pedestrian counts for neighborhoods that really need it can actually be a positive benefit. Another assumption, especially early on, again, I joined the program in 2015 in a different role. I've just been the supervisor for a year now. But assuming that businesses could be prepared to perfectly navigate an imperfect regulatory system, that's tough. And again, all of us at this table, we know that what we've implemented is not perfect. We'll never be perfect, but that we're trying to make it better as time goes on. And that's something I'm going to talk about a lot here. And if you bump into me out in the lobby, is to be adaptive and to change. That's so important, and not to be married to the assumptions you've made early on. They may not be true, right? Those assumptions may not end up being accurate. To be able to step back and say, hey, we were wrong about that. We'd like to get it right. That's very, very important to us. And yeah, the concerns about the for-hire buses. In Portland, you can't have a for-hire vehicle where people are either smoking or vaporizing tobacco or cannabis, so that is definitely not allowed. And a lot more I could say, but in the interest of time, I'll cut it there.
Well, Brandon, Kat mentioned the issue with the state and the laws evolving at the state. And then, for the most part, our laws are based on what's coming out of the state. And when the state's changing so quickly, it's hard for us to keep up. Can you share with us what it's like for you working with the state? And are there some natural tensions there? And how do you navigate that?
Yeah, we have a good working relationship with the state of Oregon, but there will be some natural tensions because the state is interested in the entire state. They have to write regulations that apply to an urban environment like Portland as much as they do to a rural environment like Prineville. So the city of Portland, when we're at the table at the Rules Advisory Committee, for example, when OLCC, the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, when they're changing their rules, we want to represent the view of the city of Portland while still being mindful that these rules are meant for the entire state. And it's true that things do change quickly, both at the state and the local level. And one thing I'm not going to talk too much now because there's a panel on it tomorrow, but social consumption, that issue came up during the legislative session in 2017. It's going to come up again in 2019. And those are the kinds of things, building code, fire code requirements, hours of operation, delivery to consumers at their home. I mean, all of these things are regulated at the state level and also impact the city. And then one more natural tension would be, the city of Portland may want to pursue policies that are explicitly not allowed by the state. So we can't say, hey, you can come to Portland and do something the state doesn't allow. That's not the way it works. And so we have to do our best to make our positions clear and keep those working relationships healthy while providing feedback and being mindful that, again, when the state's making rules at the state level, that's kind of their ballpark, and we'll do our best to give our feedback. But yeah, that's always an interesting give and take.
So how many state regulators do we have in the audience? Okay, so we'll watch our comments a little more carefully.
Thank you for the reminder. I appreciate that.
But I think it really is, it's a challenge for all of us. It's a challenge for you guys to work with us and get your information to us and us the same. Darcy, I know you had some comments about working with the state.
Yeah, so back in 2014 when we were starting to implement this, we decided we wanted to try and get a good working relationship with our state, and we invited them over, the head of the state of Nevada of the marijuana program at the time, to come and let's have our doors open. Here's our lines of communication. Here's how we're going to deliver information. And we were all on the same page. And then their regulations said one thing, and our regulations, have to try and match that. And when we were trying to get information back, all of a sudden, communication stopped. They wanted everything from us, but we weren't getting it back the other way. And I think it had a lot to do with that they didn't think they were allowed to share the information. So I don't blame them for it, but it makes it very difficult for us to do our jobs and make sure that we're all following the same page when we're not having that two-way street. And we did also set up this Southern Nevada local conference call with the state. We would do a monthly call with the regulators from the state, and all of us would come on the phone, and we would, hey, here's what we're seeing, here's the problems that we have, do you have answers for us? And it was always, well, we'll have to get back to you on that. And we would maybe get 50% of our answers. And so we would sort of kind of have to make things up on the fly, trying to make sure we're not breaking any rules, but we needed answers, and things were coming at us so fast. And we just weren't getting the information fast enough. So that was kind of a challenge, but I think the relationship has been better lately.
Well, with Joe and Kat, you're dealing with the same state. What are your tactics for keeping that communication open and getting information?
Well, first, Kat and I also talk on a regular basis along with our counterparts from other cities, and so that's one of the first things that we do. I think overall our relationship with the Bureau of Cannabis Control and the other state agencies as a whole is pretty good. The Bureau Chief, Lori Ajax, has been very accessible to I think myself and others. I think where I see challenges, they're both kind of potentially big and small, but a lot of the day-to-day ones of, hey, we had a state inspector come in and told us X, Y, and Z, and 2 days before that we had a city inspector come by and tell us something different, and they were both pretty close, and well, I think our interpretation of the code is right. I think working all of that out is going to just take a little bit of time.
And I'll echo that. It's been extremely helpful to be able to have a group of peers to call on a regular basis. I probably communicate most regularly with Joe in Sacramento, Nicole Elliott, who runs the San Francisco office, and Greg Miner, who's here, who runs the Oakland office. Even just recently, in the last 48 hours, we had a situation come up where I needed to get in touch with all 3 state agencies, send an email out, and we're able to get on the phone with the chiefs of these 3 state agencies. And so I think that that shows a tremendous effort on their end. It hasn't always been that way. We all have our own responsibilities, and sometimes we operate in silos. So to the extent that we are communicating, I think that that's been extremely helpful. There are kind of 2 policy issues that we engage with they're huge issues that we engage with on a regular basis. The regulatory side, and 3 regulatory agencies that have, at this point, hundreds of pages of regulation that are subject to interpretation. And just as Joe said, we want to assume that our interpretation is the correct interpretation, but they may not always be. And so there needs to be a constant line of communication to understand how these regulations impact our local programs. And then we saw over, on the legislative side, we saw over 65 bills introduced in the legislature. And so it does take a lot to track all of these different changes that are happening on both the regulatory side and on the legislative side. And every single time these changes happen, we have to reevaluate our program.
I mean, and this is really a universal issue for all of us here in this room, whether you're with a state or with a city. In Denver now, after 5 years, we're seeing some headway. From the very beginning, Molly and I and a couple of our team members would have monthly lunches with our state representatives, and those were Andrew Freeman and Louis Koski. So we've always had monthly lunches with them. Then we sort of rolled it out to quarterly lunches with the Marijuana Enforcement Division and the Department of Ag if we had something going on with that. In about our 2nd year, we did a cross-training, inspector cross-training, where we had like every single agency, you know, fire and CPD and excise and license and environmental health. And then we had the state agencies, we had the DAs come in, and we sort of did, I think it was a couple of hours, but we had each inspecting agency say, hi, my name is such and such, I work for such and such department. Our mission is this, and here are the top 3 things we're looking for, and here's my phone number. And I think that that started where you know, heard kind of at least the very basics of what people were doing, and you knew that if you saw something, whatever fire might say, call me if you see this, you know, people started developing those relationships and could really help each other. So it's been 5 years from us. Oh, and now it's even gotten to where, like, our licensing techs will go over to the state and spend a half day with the state licensing techs. Our inspectors will go back and forth, and our data people are sharing data better. But it's tough because we're all moving really quickly, and as we said, we're all developing our regulations, and so it's hard to stay aligned. So I think another comment that we all hear about is that we all feel like we've been building the fire truck on the way to the fire, flying the plane while we're building it. All of those types of things. And I know, Joe, you've really, in particular, felt that. Do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts on that and how you did it?
Thank you. Well, there's just a lot of unknowns, right? I mean, it goes back to kind of like the assumption question, and like we made a whole bunch of assumptions, and I think, you know, well, many of them proved to be kind of more or less accurate. They certainly weren't accurate enough for, you know, things like accounting and budgets. We thought enforcement was going to cost X and permits were going to be Y, and it would kind of all pay for itself, and that turned out to be mostly true, but not entirely true. So, you know, between the infrastructure that's needed to do this and the budget consequences that go along with that, as well as on the policy side, we've had to remain constantly adaptive. My office was created in 2016. After 6 months of being on the job, I took back a kind of revised staffing model to City Council, and 12 months after that, I'm getting ready to go back to them with potentially another change to that staffing model. We've changed permit structures for some of our manufacturing permits, distribution permits, before we've even had a chance to issue them. because we got it wrong. And so I think acknowledging kind of when things aren't going as you thought and recognizing where you need to change is going to be incredibly valuable to your organization as you move forward with this. Being, again, as flexible, as Brandon said, as flexible and adaptive as you can, and not being married to any particular idea.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I just kind of wanted to echo what Joe said. For us, you know, in 2014, we had this really robust ordinance for the city of Las Vegas, and we thought we had a really great job. We're like, okay, this is how it's going to work. We're going to regulate everything from A to Z. And every step that they take, this is how they're going to take it. And we went through and we thought, yeah, look at us. And some of the other Southern Nevada localities even copied parts of our code. And we're like, yeah, we're the gold standard. And after businesses came in and started operating, you know, slowly they started complaining. They complained to our city council, and they complained to the industry, and they complained to us. And they said, you guys, you're really too strict. Our fees were $75,000 annual for a dispensary every year. Plus, you had to report your gross revenue twice a year, 7% on anything that you sold out of that was a manufactured product, and and then 5% on a raw product. And so twice a year you'd pay us those fees. Our cultivation fees were like $20,000 for the first 5,000 square feet of space, and then $10,000 for each additional 5,000. They were really, really high. And you know, right next door, our Clark County was charging like 3% of gross sales, and it was really just this disparity. And so, having to listen to the industry, having to listen to everybody, we have probably revamped our code, I would say probably 10 times since 2014, and we're still not quite there yet. So it has been a learning process, and then of course with legislative session coming in, as Kat was talking about, having to change what you thought was how you wanted to regulate it, and the state saying, no, you can't do that. They actually last year capped our fees and said you can't charge more than 3%. So there goes our $75,000 in our budgets.
And those are real challenges that we faced in Denver too. How have you guys overcome that, trying to anticipate their specific regulatory needs and come up with the right answer, but still be willing to track and monitor and make changes when you need to?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that. And the first is be really clear about the processes by which you can change your rules and regulations. Is it state law? Is it city code? Are they administrative processes? Do your staff have discretion over some of those things? It's important to know before they come up so that you know how the ways in which you can change and adapt. That's very important. The second is make sure you're letting reality shape your policies and not the other way around. Again, if you're seeing something on the ground that's not working, I would highly recommend to not kind of go to the ends of the earth to defend it, to be open to understanding why it may not be working and then changing and adapting. And the last thing is especially for jurisdictions who are just getting up and running, I mean, everything is coming at you so unbelievably fast. It is very, very hard to track everything at the same time. You're worried about getting forms, you're getting the website up and running, communications are going out, you're getting a database set up and spreadsheets, all this stuff. That in all of that, don't forget about other issues that are also critically important. And for me, what comes to mind with that is, you know, the populations who are most affected by cannabis prohibition, those populations are not the ones we're seeing benefiting from this new legal regulated industry. And to me, that does not feel right. That does not feel fair. And so don't lose sight of the broader picture of cannabis now being legal and regulated. And for Portland, I mean, we took a small but important step last month passing a social equity program that provides extra assistance to small businesses, to those who contract with minority and women-owned emerging small businesses, and for those who actually have cannabis convictions in their past. And that's something that we should have thought about 3 years ago, not now. And so again, for all of you who are doing this, yes, like get the details right, be sure the processes are tight, but also be able to zoom out and look at the broader view is also extremely important.
And I'll just say, you know, there are probably headlines that come out every 2 weeks, or it seems like every week, that suggest that the city of Los Angeles isn't doing things fast enough. And for me, the goal has never been to build a fast plane, but to build one that was going to be sustainable, and we want to be able to do this the right way. And that means taking a couple of steps back and really trying to figure out what you want your either local economy, your local community to look like 10 to 20 years from now. So I'm not very much concerned about the timeline, but what the impact and result of all of our efforts are going to mean. Folks want licenses, and there seems to be an assumption in the industry that there is a licensing fairy, that can poof and you get a license, but there is an entire infrastructure that's necessary for you to produce and hand out a license. And for many of the folks who who are sitting at this table, it's my name that's on that license. And so I want to make sure that before someone gets a license that they've gone through proper building and fire code inspections, and that we're having a conversation about health and youth prevention. And so I think that part of the biggest challenge has been trying to manage high expectations of the many different stakeholders who are involved in this process. And for local regulators, we're talking about things that are hyper-local. Unlike some of these state agencies, we engage with local neighborhood councils. There are 96 different neighborhood councils in the city of Los Angeles, and there's a lot of NIMBYism when it comes to this industry. And so it's not just the industry, it's not just elected officials, it's not just community members, and it's the whole picture that we're trying to navigate and make progress on.
And I think when I think back on it, the example that I always think, and I might sort of have it a little different, but I remember initially Fire going into a marijuana manufacturer and saying, the story is, you need an X, Y, and Z type hood. And they put that hood in, and we thought they were doing certain type of extractions and a certain level of extractions. And we went back a couple of months later, and they were doing significantly bigger work, then they needed a X, Y, and Z, really much bigger hood. I think they can use the technical terms a little bit better than I can when they talk to you. But the industry then is mad. I mean, we feel like we know what they're doing, so we say, here's the solution. But then we didn't really know exactly what they were doing. They were doing something bigger. So then it's, well, you need to backtrack, we revise our rules. We do need to remember, every time we change our rules and regulations, the industry is incurring an additional cost. So one thing we've tried to do, it hasn't worked yet, but for the past couple of years, we've told the industry, tell us what you're doing, bring to us what you're doing. If you're developing something new, and even if you want to keep it proprietary, let us know ahead of time so we can walk down that path together with you, and we can talk to our attorneys and see if we can keep it confidential. But let's walk that path together, rather than being in the situation where they're asking for forgiveness and not permission. So I don't have the answer for that. I think it's just continuing to keep the lines of communication open and just be willing to be flexible and nimble.
Can I speak to that briefly?
Yeah.
And I will keep it brief. I think that part of what we can all do, and you're right that as much as we try to be open and available, it's up to folks to come to you. But do make yourself open and available. Meet people where they are. If people want to meet with you, find time on your calendar to do it. Find time on your calendar to make it out to their facility so they're not just coming to your office. Make sure you're answering your voicemails and emails in a timely fashion. Because here's the deal for me. If I'm a resource, if I'm available for somebody, it makes it more likely they're going to come back next time. It's going to make it more likely they can navigate our processes and that they have the information that they need to succeed, and also that they're compliant and that they're safe. So really, in my opinion, going the extra mile to be accessible is extremely important. And again, it won't guarantee that you'll get that cross collaboration, but it'll make it more likely.
Okay, so switching tracks to another issue that we dealt with maybe 5 years ago, and I know some of you are in various processes of dealing with it. I'll start off with Brandon. How did you deal with, or are you still dealing with, businesses businesses that you had up and running that were illegal operations prior to legalization? And what have you done, if anything, to sort of bring them into the regulated market?
Yeah, when our program first started, we began by licensing medical dispensaries, which were differently regulated, I would say, and I think most people would agree that the medical cannabis side, the regulations are a little less strict than on the recreational side. At least that's been the experience in Oregon. So we wanted to make sure that they came into the fold, that folks who were operating for a while had a pathway to get compliant and to get legal. And then, separate from that, we've definitely seen that there have been businesses who were operating either, quasi-legally or not legally, who want to then get licensed and get legal. The tricky balance, and this is true of everything having to do with cannabis, is all a balance, but you want to make sure folks are safe, you want to make sure they're following the rules, but also you want to make sure that your structure encourages people to go through that process. And, particularly one thing, I think that there's a breakout panel for this, for fire and building code. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a plans examiner, I'm not an expert. And there are businesses who hire engineers, and they are the experts, but they're not engaging with the city's processes, your local jurisdiction's building a fire code, and they go, we got it, it's safe, it's fine. That may be true, but the reason why you have those codes in place and those local inspectors is to make sure that that is true. So as much as you can encourage them to get into those processes, the better. But yes, it is very tricky.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that?
So we had an existing industry before all of our regulations were in place, and I guess what is kind of for me embedded in that question, what was our philosophical approach to dealing with this? And this is one of the reasons why I really like this topic. I mean, you can't sit in too many rooms and talk about federalism and behavioral economics and all in the same topic. But for me, this is really about economics, right? So what we were trying to do is get a whole bunch of people, the consumers, and get them to purchase through a legal infrastructure. And in order to do that, the market needs to be accessible and prices need to be competitive. And it was kind of within that philosophy that we decided, rather than shutting down these existing cultivators that were in our city, that some of which had been cultivating in that building for one of them told us 17 years. So he wasn't exactly new to it. We instead said, okay, when we were adopting a framework, we said, okay, raise your hand and tell us that you're doing it. And we created a registration process. And we said, okay, we got 150 plus people register. Of those, it turned out about 40 of them were actually cultivating. And so we created a registration process. Now, were those buildings compliant? Absolutely not. Like, for a whole bunch of reasons. Some of them were more compliant in terms of building standards than others. I mean, some of them, it was just a hot mess. But we created a process for them to become legal, and we're still working through that process. We've had some people successfully come out the other end, but our whole approach was to take this existing industry and try and funnel them through and into a legally compliant structure.
So you still have businesses operating that aren't licensed?
They are operating we've allowed them, they've applied for a business operating permit with the city of California as a dual licensing requirement. They've obtained their temporary license from the state, but for us, that local permit is going to be the last thing they get. That is both the carrot and the stick that we're holding over their head. And so in the interim, we said, okay, in addition to your operating permit, you also need to submit building plans and go through all of that process and make sure that your facility meets all of the building and fire codes. And after they get their certificate of occupancy, we'll then be issuing a business operations permit.
And so, Kat, I would assume you have that challenge too, with just having passed a Proposition 64 in January. Can you tell us what you're doing with that?
Sure. So our local Measure M, which passed in March of 2017, is what allowed the City of Los Angeles to the first time license, regulate, and tax adult use cannabis. Within our local Measure M, we specifically established that we were going to give priority processing to our existing medical marijuana dispensaries. So we have a phased licensing process in general, and the first phase was for our existing medical marijuana dispensaries. That's what we largely refer to as phase 1. Our phase 2 is intended to deal with this cannabis immaculate conception issue and to bring in the supply chain, these cultivators and manufacturers who had been previously supplying the retail locations, but it's been a real challenge. There are thousands of unregulated operators in the city of Los Angeles, and I'll pause to make a note. When I go out and communicate, I've been trying to let folks know that similar to how we use the term cannabis instead of marijuana now, I think it's no longer appropriate for us to use the term black market to mean criminal market. If we mean unregulated market, we should use that term. So it's a blanket ask for folks not to use the term black market to mean criminal market. But part of the challenge is that because of the way that the state of California had developed this collective model, anybody could have been an existing supplier to a retail business. I could be growing at home in my garage, and I'd go up to a retail shop and say, I've got 10 pounds I'd like to sell you as a part of this collective model. And that's how a lot of these businesses really started. And so we are experiencing real difficulty with trying to, one, just allow folks to know what's happening. I think that sometimes we assume that the industry knows what we're doing and knows what the state of California is doing, but we hold regular meetings, and it's almost as if folks were living under a rock and didn't know that, Proposition 64 passed and we have regulations now, and that there is a Department of Cannabis regulation that folks need licensing for. So I think on one hand, we have a large responsibility to educate and let folks know what the process is, but it can be difficult to do so when we're, one, doing the process for the first time, and learning the process ourselves. And so to the extent, as Brandon said, that we can be available, we've tried to, but there was one point where we had more email accounts than we had staff, just to kind of deal with the incoming and trying to communicate with community members and have that happen in an organized fashion and communicate with industry folks and applicants and have that operate in an organized fashion. And I think that part of the challenge, the real challenge that folks in the state of California are experiencing right now, has to deal with some of the assumptions that folks made back in 2016 and 2015 when these frameworks were first being developed at the state level. So for the past year, California state licensing and regulatory agencies have been issuing temporary licenses. And those temporary licenses, these state agencies are going to stop issuing these temporary licenses at the end of the year. And if you don't have a temporary license, you can't get a new type of license called a provisional license. And the bar for the state temporary license was essentially very low. The provisional license is a little bit higher, and the annual license is an even larger hurdle for industry members to get access to. And so what we're experiencing right now, and I'm sure Joe may have his own experiences, but our operators are trying to get this state temporary license. And the truth of the matter is that because of the process where folks have to go through, our fire department and our Department of Building and Safety and security plans have to be reviewed, and we're dealing with hundreds of applicants at the same time. Some of these folks just aren't going to be able to clear that hurdle before the end of the year. In hindsight, it would have been much nicer if the state temporary license would have extended into 2019. But that's something that we have no control over at this point. And so for jurisdictions, states that have an existing market, assume that that transition time is going to be at least 3 times longer than you would regularly imagine. You're dealing with operators who, for decades, have intentionally tried to avoid any type of government agency. And now they're being asked to deal with 15 different agencies, and any of these 15 different agencies could be the sole reason why they are denied a license. And so it's just a huge effort to try and, one, orchestrate, and then also to articulate to operators.
Thank you. And Darcy, do you have that big of a problem?
You know, no, I don't think we do. Maybe I'm just naive, but our city of Las Vegas is quite small, and we have a really great enforcement team. I think what we found was medical marijuana was allowable since the year 2000, but it was really for home grows. And what would happen is kind of what Kat said is they would grow at home and they would find a location like, I don't know, like a botanical place or where they sell like candles and whatever. And they would come over and they would try to sell it to them, or people would come together and they would create what they call like a co-op, and they would share their marijuana. Our enforcement team would go out and they would find that, you know, they walked in and there was already a case, like a glass case with price tags already on it, and they were running as a dispensary. We have a really great relationship with our police department, and our enforcement officers would just kind of go through and do the regular inspection, and the other officer would go outside and make a call to narcotics, and they would come in and they would shut them down. So we saw a lot of that in the early 2000s through until we got the 2014 regulations passed. And since then, we haven't had too many problems. There have been cases where they found illegal drugs, and again, we work with our Metro to get them off, but we don't have a lot of thousands of unlicensed businesses. I think pretty much anyone that's selling, growing, producing marijuana in the city is licensed. There's probably a really tiny handful of, you know, of the criminal element that's out there. I think we've done a really good job there.
Well, and that sounds like a real challenge for LA. What we had in Denver was a lot lesser of a challenge. When we legalized in 2014, our city council put into law that we would prioritize, let the previously existing medical marijuana businesses that were up and running, we'd let them transition to retail marijuana first. But we still weren't sure who was licensed, who wasn't licensed. Some might have a license from the state, some might have a license from the city, but not also from the state. Some had a zoning permit and they thought that was their license. So we got together with all the inspectors, and our inspectors rode around, and we we just, what is it called, inventoried all of these different businesses that were out there. And we wound up with 175. As opposed to thousands, you know. So that was sort of early January, right after we legalized. We had 175 businesses. We drafted form letters, dear business, you know, you have a state license but not a city license. You have a city license but not a state license. You have nothing. And we told them you need to be licensed or cease operations by July 1st. So we gave them 6 months. In that letter, we said, we'll walk you through it, and we will have these 3 different permitting workshops, and we'll help you, and we'll do all this stuff. And by the time we got down to January 1st, we had a number of them had dropped out and could not get licensed because they were maybe too close to a school, or they violated area restrictions. Or in Colorado, we have a prohibition against people working in the industry with certain types of convictions, criminal convictions. So maybe they had a criminal conviction, so they were not able to work in the industry, and went through and ultimately got all those people either licensed or out of the business, so we could then start in January with a firm regulated industry, which we feel like then, right, incentivizes people to get licensed. You know, licensed people who are being subjected to the fire department coming in or other stuff doesn't like it when they see the guy down the street who doesn't have a license and isn't paying taxes and isn't having to conform with everything else. You know, now looking back on it, we know that we lost a lot of operators who had been operating for years. That maybe if we were doing it differently now, maybe we would have done something different. We did try to help as many people as we could clear those hurdles, but where we couldn't because of state law, we just couldn't. Any other comments on that piece?
So I just want to add, because I'm looking at one of my friends from LAPD who's standing in the back, so I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we work, even as a licensing and regulatory agency, very close with law enforcement, and because we have such an issue with the proliferation of unlicensed operators in the city of Los Angeles, we're really trying to reevaluate even how we go about reducing those number of operators. And so one of the things that the city council, in particular some city council members are looking to do is to really try and move LAPD, if it's not what they consider to be significant criminal activity, out of the enforcement role. We have had council members who are suggesting, and we're moving forward with policies that would disconnect utilities at these facilities, because it'd be very difficult to cultivate cannabis if you don't have access to water or electricity. We have council members who are interested in padlocking, using building code to padlock facilities, to actually lock operators out. But again, getting away from kind of heavy law enforcement unless circumstances really call for that effort. But I appreciate the partnership that the Department of Cannabis Regulation has with LAPD and our other law enforcement agencies as we try and tackle what will be a difficult few years as we try and transition.
Yeah. So I'll ask one more question of the panel members, and then we'll open it up for questions for all of you. And just my one big, general, broad question, and Brandon, maybe we could start with you. I hate this when people ask me this question, so I'm enjoying asking it to you.
I can tell.
Has legalization been a positive or a negative for your community?
It's been a positive. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the amount of cannabis sales that's now taking place in our legal and regulated market, where we can track it, where it can be tested, where we know the buildings are safe, where the tax money is going to help very important efforts, for example, in the city of Portland to help people clear their records and get workforce development. When you look at the infrastructure improvements that have happened in our neighborhoods, when you look at the decriminalization of cannabis and how law enforcement can now focus on more important priorities, it's been an overwhelming positive. It doesn't mean that it's been perfect. It hasn't been. Again, we've made plenty of mistakes, and I think the important thing is to own it, to continue changing and continue adapting. But yeah, to me, it's a very clear positive for our community.
Great, great. And Darcy, you being a little bit more new in than some of us?
I would agree. It's probably been more positive than negative. The revenues that it's brought into our state and to our city is astronomical. It's insane. I didn't realize how much money was going to be there. The fact that, as Brandon said, that if people are going to do this, they may as well do it in a safe manner, that we have actions in place that we can look at the public safety, make sure that they're tested, to make sure that the regulations are in place, that people are buying this in a trusted source like the alcohol. It's been more positive than negative.
Joe?
I completely agree. So I think there's actually, it can only be better, right? You all have cannabis in your community, whether you have a legal cannabis industry or a cannabis industry, quote unquote, that is kind of operating illicitly. You all have cannabis in your community. So really the questions is, do you want it purchased and sold through licensed entities that are going to do things like check IDs? So from that kind of public health, public safety perspective, regulation can only improve the situation in terms of access to cannabis for young people. It has what I would call a tangential benefit of tax revenue, but we really only had nowhere to kind of go but up. There are consequences to cannabis, absolutely. Those consequences currently exist within our communities and have existed within our communities. I don't think we've been talking about them as openly as we have. We're now getting also more science around why young persons shouldn't ingest cannabis. But really the conversations around the hazards of cannabis have been lacking, but the regulation of it only improves public health and public safety.
Kat?
Yeah, I'll echo what my colleagues have shared. Positive, but not perfect. I appreciate that cannabis legalization and regulation has forced leaders to be attentive to communities and to industries that probably weren't receiving any attention before. It's allowed us to have very intentional conversations about criminal justice and social justice issues. In the state of California, folks are able to have their records expunged and their records cleared based on the new provisions of law. We have a community reinvestment fund tax revenue going towards communities that have been impacted. We're starting to see first-in-time real information. If you're a cannabis consumer, prior to Proposition 64 passing, you probably had no idea what was in the cannabis that you're consuming. There are now mandatory reporting of potency in various concentrations. Businesses, for the first time, are having legal protections and don't have to face and kind of experience what it has meant to operate in an illegal market. And so I think that we're making progress. And, you know, if we started at prohibition, I think that there's a lot of progress that's been made.
So in Denver, I think, I still am always, there's so many pros and cons, and there's always still so many things we don't know. That's why I'm usually so hesitant sometimes to answer that question. I would say that, you know, revenue's up, but that wasn't the reason why we legalized. But revenue's up, crime's relatively stable, and we have not seen a huge increase in youth usage, thank goodness. And in fact, our most recent Healthy Kids survey showed that our youth usage decreased over the last couple of years. But one of the things we do have a concern about in Denver is illegal growing and what we're calling home grows. And we are seeing, because, right, it's legal to grow at home now, we do have parameters around that, that people are not following. And they can, in Denver, hide in plain sight. You know, and they can go purchase their equipment to grow marijuana, and no, it doesn't raise a red flag for anyone. What we have thought, what we've always thought from the beginning, that the implication of a legal market does not mean that that illicit market would just poof and vanish right away. We've still got work to it for us to do around that, which is one of the reasons why we've used some of the marijuana money to hire additional law enforcement officers. But I really do think, when you think about it, for years and years and years, you know, arresting the marijuana drug dealer, and another one will replace them. Arresting drug dealers, we know what happens. They go to jail and somebody else new replaces them. But if over the long term we can take that customer and bring that customer into the regulated market, then we can help to start getting rid of that illicit market. And that's where I really see the real benefit. As I like to say, you know, we don't go buy gin from our neighbor's bathtub anymore, because we can go down the street and we can get our particular brand, and we're not going to get arrested doing it, and we know what we're getting. And now hopefully that's what the regulated market is doing with the safety and knowing that the product's tested and knowing what you're getting, that ultimately over time it will help diminish that illicit market.
I think if I could just add, that's really important, I think, point to me, is that we tried prohibition. We tried maximum enforcement. It didn't work. Unless the goal was to put a lot of people in jail and prison, then it worked, right? But if the goal was to get rid of cannabis, it didn't work. So we tried maximum enforcement. We made it as illegal as it could get, and we still all have cannabis in our community. And so for me, this is really like, okay, let's try something different. Let's try economics and create markets for this that, you know, have structure to them and provide things for public safety and public health. No one gets to ban cannabis.
That's what all of you guys get to do over these next couple of years. So we'll move into questions. I see Macon. Do you have a question for us?
So for cities that are new to marijuana regulation, for cities that are early in the process, one of the most impactful and important decisions they'll make is to how many marijuana stores will they have in their town. And there are bookends to this. When at the same time that Denver had 175 licenses, medical, that were transitioning to recreational, Oakland, California had chosen to limit the number of licenses for medical marijuana to 4. So those are kind of bookends. But I'm interested to know if the cities represented up there have found any principles for making a decision about how many marijuana stores there should be, have been successful. What do you think of when you're embarking in new regulation and you think, how many stores do we want or need in our city?
I think that is a great question. I mean, on the 13th of this month, I'm actually appearing before council to begin that conversation. So we have 30, we're a population of 500,000 people. It's like 1 to every 16,000 people. I did a quick survey of other cities in California and others, and there's no kind of roadmap to that's kind of your number. I think each community is going to have to figure that out. My advice would be to, you can always add more, but again, you need to have, the market needs to be accessible to the consumer. So you're going to have to really evaluate that within the community. Our 30 dispensaries haven't been problematic, and we're going to have a conversation around adding a few more.
Well, I guess the question following up on that is, who here has caps on the number of their licenses?
Yeah, so in the state of Nevada, we're capped, and the state's the one that actually regulates how many each jurisdiction gets, and I think it's actually worked out really well for us.
Do you have a cap, Kat?
Sure. So we have what I like to call a soft cap on the number of licenses that will be issued. The City Council decided that there were 3 areas where we were going to put this soft cap: storefront retail locations, cultivation facilities, and manufacturing facilities. When it comes to retail facilities, the ratio that the City Council went along with was that we would allow for 1 retail facility per 10,000 residents. With about 4 million people, we could see 400 storefront retail locations. The reason why I say it is a soft cap is that once the department were to issue that specific number of licenses, we have a system that would allow City Council to allow for that number to be exceeded. And so right now, again, we have 169 of our existing businesses that have been able to transition. But even with 400, if we move forward with 400, that would still be a reduction in the number of facilities that are actually operating in the city when we consider the unlicensed businesses.
Brandon?
We don't have a cap, but there are no cap, but there are a couple forces that will artificially limit the number of licenses. The state has a 1,000-foot buffer from schools for retailers, as does the city. So that limits your siting. Then the city has a 1,000-foot buffer between retailers, so that's above and beyond the states. That limits the landscape even more. Then you have zoning. So in the city of Portland, a retailer can't be in a residential zone. And then, of course, you have, the free market at work. So, again, in Portland, 150 retailers, a town of 580,000 people, more retailers than we have Starbucks or McDonald's. But there is no hard cap.
Great. Okay, next question.
My name is Ali, and I'm with the City of Santa Ana in Orange County. And I was curious, after hearing a lot about the regulations from some of the other cities in California and outside of California, what, if any, measures are you taking to engage economic development and economic development staff or tools or resources, if that's even on your kind of agenda, to kind of take it beyond the core of just cultivation, distribution, manufacturing, testing, and retail, and elevate it to the next level to, bring in the ancillary supportive industries and really create like a hub and an economic cluster in your jurisdictions?
Does anybody want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, the City of Portland works with Prosper Portland, which is the city's economic development agency for small business support and workforce development. And we've also been cultivating relationships with Travel Portland. And particularly in Portland, when you're thinking about, again, the prospect of social consumption on the horizon, that's going to be another opportunity, not only for cannabis licensees who want consumers to consume on their licensed premise, but also for people who might have a venue who don't want a cannabis license to sell cannabis, but want to invite people to their venue. That may be a way for people with less capital to engage with this regulated industry. So those are some of the things that we are doing.
Anyone else?
I would just say, just to add on to that, we're not working directly with our AUD staff, but the next level for us is that social use venue, and I know that we're having that discussion tomorrow, but the City of Las Vegas does have a draft ordinance out there for public to comment on. We are going to try and get to that next level where we're calling it, instead of a consumption lounge, a social use venue, where they sort of dictate what the business model looks like, but they're going to be allowed to consume cannabis at the location.
And I would say from Denver's standpoint, when we first started in 2014, Molly and I did engage our Office of Economic Development, but at that time, they were really concerned about engaging with us because of, being new and being first, and there was always that worry that if they did anything to help, marijuana businesses, that could jeopardize their federal funding. But we now have them at the table with us, and we're having conversations. We would like to see and be able to, continue to foster innovation and agility in this industry, and we need their guidance. We're going to be doing a study, a study pretty soon. Our chief economist will be doing a study looking at the market conditions, and looking at where there may be opportunities for ancillary businesses supporting the legal marijuana business. All right.
Thank you for taking my question. It's around social justice and social equity. We've seen that marijuana convictions have disproportionately affected minority and underserved populations. So I'm just curious how your cities have addressed or attempted to remedy these issues. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to have a breakout lunch meeting on that on Friday. Are you signed up for that? Good, good, good. So we can talk about that generally high level. Does anyone want to take that?
So the City of Los Angeles does have a social equity program, and this program was largely born out of a real understanding that there was a need to acknowledge and address the harms that primarily low-income and minority communities experience by way of cannabis criminalization and the larger war on drugs. The way that this program has developed thus far is there's an intention to identify folks who meet program criteria within the city, folks who are low income, live in disproportionately impacted areas, high cannabis arrest communities, or actually have nonviolent cannabis convictions, receive priority processing and other types of technical assistance. Part of the challenge, just as there are challenges with launching a licensing and regulatory program, we have experienced real challenges in launching our social equity programs. Fortunately, Senator Bradford's 1294 was a piece of legislation that would provide state funding for local jurisdictions that have social equity programs. So now there's $10 million on the table for jurisdictions in the state of California that have these programs. And thus far, it's focused on licensing. I think that that's kind of the first step in this process, because that's, as a regulator, that's what we're primarily responsible for. But I think that as these conversations continue, we'll see the conversation around social justice and social equity extend further into how do we reinvest tax revenue into these communities, how do we ensure that folks just, not just having access to a cannabis job, but that folks have access to all jobs. People who consume cannabis still have issues getting jobs, and so the intention in the larger scheme is to, one, recognize that community members have not been treated the same in the past, and that with current and future cannabis policies, we have an opportunity and real responsibility to ensure that the cannabis policies and their enforcement don't have anything to do with where you live or what your income is or the color of your skin.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier the City of Portland just began its social equity program, and I'll embarrass my colleague Jeffrey Van Kent, who did incredible work on that. So that does provide support in the form of a license credit to small businesses, to those who have owners or staff who have cannabis convictions, and businesses who work with minority and women-owned emerging small businesses. The City of Portland also sets aside a portion of its local tax for record clearing, for expungement, for workforce development, and then broadly, the best way you can get people who aren't traditionally involved in the cannabis industry is to lower the barriers to entry. So Portland just lowered its licensing fee for micro tiers. In the future, I talked about perhaps venues for social consumption can be one area. Perhaps, right now in Oregon, you can deliver cannabis to consumers, but only if you have a state license as a retailer. Perhaps there's a future in which you can have a third-party courier that can provide that service and be able to participate. So all of those are very much on our radar.
Great. Anyone else?
We have a social equity program as well. I would describe it as a small business support and mentoring center where persons either directly impacted by the criminalization of cannabis or from neighborhoods that were disproportionately impacted by the criminalization of cannabis that are either in the cannabis industry or want to be in the cannabis industry that can go to this center and get help with all of the supports and services that really any small business would need in order to be successful.
I'm not aware of any programs in the city like that.
So, and in Denver, we are moving forward with that. That was one of the phone calls I had with Seattle the other day, sort of with both of us being, up and running. And not having done that initially. It's where do we do, how do we start? We were just sort of making sure the sky didn't fall. And at the time, too, when we first got started, we didn't know how profitable would this business be. Do we want to be setting somebody up for something that might not be successful? And then again, we had our Mayor's Office of Economic Development concerned about the whole illegality piece. So right now what we're doing, the mayor has directed us to move forward with vacating convictions. So we're working on that, the marijuana lower level charge convictions. And then we've got a work group that's working on looking at what are the opportunities, first around just reinvestment in communities with some of those marijuana tax dollars. We've already done that. I think the mayor mentioned we are using some of the marijuana tax dollars for our affordable housing fund. We've used the marijuana tax dollars to reinvest in neighborhoods and capital expenditures in some neighborhoods that were, we believe, disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And then the next part of that whole conversation is around the licensing piece, the workforce development piece, and what does that look like, and what's the best program for our community. So I can't remember who's next. Okay.
Hi, Heather Sumner, Deputy City Attorney with the City of Lansing, Michigan. As a fellow municipality going through this brand new process of regulating the industry, this panel hit home for me. One of the questions I have is we're already experiencing a significant level of litigation, and I was wondering if your community or your municipality was experiencing litigation. What have you learned from that? If you're not having a lot of litigation, what about your ordinance or your infrastructure do you think is keeping that at bay?
So can you clarify for us what type of litigation? And yeah.
We are being sued primarily by applicants. We do have a cap in the City of Lansing for the retail side, and so as the applicants are denied, they are suing us. And then we're also currently the City of Lansing suing the state based on a deadline dispute and changes in the emergency rules. But we're also looking at, we're having threats come from community members, we're having threats come from patients based on perceived problems with our ordinance.
Welcome to cannabis.
Who would like to take any of these?
Well, I'll just be very brief. I mean, we've had the threat of litigation. That happens a lot. If someone is unhappy with a decision, we get the threat a lot. Unfortunately, we haven't faced those kinds of things in Portland, and maybe it is because there's no hard cap. I don't know if maybe that's the reason why, but it hasn't been an issue for us.
So part of the challenge in the city of Los Angeles is that prior to this new framework that we established, every single thing that we did related to cannabis, we got sued on. And we lost a lot of those suits in the past. So there were past policies where we had issued moratoriums, completely banned cannabis that was sued. So we expect litigation. We've done our best to try and create a framework that allows folks who feel as though they're aggrieved in some way by our process to be able to appeal decisions. So it's not just the Department of Cannabis Regulation that makes licensing decisions. We have a 5-member Cannabis Regulation Commission that will hear appeals. We have administrative hearing officers that can hear appeals. Because we have that process in place, folks actually have to follow that path before they would have standing to sue us. And I think we've been lucky thus far. We haven't issued a bunch of denials. It's taken us a while to process applications. So of the various phases of licensing that we've had thus far, I believe that we've only made determinations finding folks ineligible and sent out that to 6 different people, or to 11 folks, and 6 folks have appealed. But the more folks that get denied, the more folks will appeal. And so we have a legal team that is completely dedicated to the department. I believe that one of my attorneys is in the room. I will point him out. Alex, can you raise your hand? So if you have, and this is what I always do when I go to meetings, I point everyone towards Alex and make them go talk to him. But if you're interested and concerned about litigation, I'd go talk to Alex Freeman in the corner. Joe.
Yeah, welcome to cannabis, I guess. I joke, but it's true. I think most of our litigation that we've seen has really been centered around our actions taken around enforcement of illegal residential cultivation. I expect that we may see some as we begin to possibly deny applications for one reason or another. But most of it's been really centered around the fines, fees, and penalties that we're assessing for illegal residential cultivation.
I would just like to add, I feel super lucky listening to what you guys are going through. The City of Las Vegas has not been sued, at least to my knowledge, and I can point out our city attorney is sitting back there, Brian Scott, if you want to ask him. But I think the main reason that we were lucky is that we specifically spelled that. I said we were super, super strict in our code, and we followed everything to a T. So if you were going to get a denial, you knew you were going to get a denial going into it. You had to do A through Z, and you had to submit A through Z, and you had to meet a specific criteria. If you didn't meet it, you didn't get licensed. We do make our applicants go through a background check investigation, and it's a full background investigation that takes months to complete. It's not the quick FBI report that our state does. I think our state got sued a lot, and because of that, it has shifted some of the licenses that were issued originally and then taken away and given to somebody else. Because they had a ranking system in place, and in some cases they didn't follow exactly the rules that they laid out. So I just really think it's important that you set your criteria, you make sure that if you're going to issue a denial that you follow those specific reasons and don't deviate from that.
May I say one more piece on that? It's something that Kat said jogged my thinking, and a text again from my colleague, Jeffrey. Thanks, Jeffrey. So when applicants do get a denial or an action taken against them, there's a lot of back and forth that happens at the staff level before that happens. There are warning letters that go out, emails, phone calls. We try really hard to not get to that point, but when it does, that decision is then reviewable by myself as the supervisor of the program. I look at that decision with fresh eyes, gather the facts, and then come back again. After that, the applicant can then go to the City of Portland's hearings office, again, reviewing the facts, again, fresh eyes, and that's all before it ever hits the court system. So it is true that perhaps that's part of the reason why we haven't been faced with that.
And so in Denver, I'll just be quick, we had one pretty major litigation related to pesticides because early on we took some action related to pesticides, and we got said we were accused of acting outside of the scope of our jurisdiction because the federal government regulates pesticides, as does the state. But in the end, our great lawyers, we navigated that and we were successful on that. We kind of argued we were standing in the gap and we weren't trying to regulate the application or use. We were protecting public safety is kind of how I understood how that came down. We also do have authority to monitor and regulate storage of hazardous materials, and so pesticides were one of them. We were successful on that. Another threatened lawsuit was when we went to ban solvent-based hash oil extractions outside of a licensed facility. We did get that ban in place, but we were threatened by individuals who said they needed to make their own hash oil. They had their way to do it. And I think kind of our response to them is their access to marijuana and access to hash oil and access to really anything you want in Denver related to marijuana is not a problem, and it's not safe to be extracting at home. So they never did sue us. But then, you know, we do, every application we have comes in, just like Brandon says, we do a really significant due diligence. We do deny applicants. I don't know how regularly, but we are denying applicants, and when we do that, we have a great group of hearing officers who are here, and the hearing officers will hear those denials of the applications, whether it's due to proximity restrictions or what the other issue is. Then it's appealed to me, and I'll make a decision, and very rarely does it go up to district court. We have had some, what we call a show cause, the Sweet Leaf case, if any of you all have followed that, where we had a business who was operating outside of the law, DPD conducted the investigation unknown to me. I'm not law enforcement, just a licensing agent. So they were conducting this undercover operation for a year, found out that Sweet Leaf was violating criminal laws, and then took action against them. They've got the criminal case pending, but we were able to do the administrative case pretty quickly where we revoked their licenses. And then they appealed that, and that probably went through the process. Well, they did appeal it to the hearing officers and has gone through that process. So part of when we first started this, I would say in 2015, the city of Denver hired almost an additional 60 people to help with the regulation of marijuana, and that included quite a number of attorneys. Molly, do you remember the numbers? 7 or maybe 12 attorneys, and that includes maybe paralegals and support people. So, okay, next.
Jesse from the City of Edmonton Fire Department. So my question surrounds product shortage, or the possibility of that anyways. So we've only had the regulated market for about 2 weeks. We're already experiencing shortages. So I just wanted to know if your municipalities had experienced that as well, and how do you think that may have affected the regulated market and also the illicit market, and maybe what countermeasures you might have employed to fix that?
Shortage of cannabis?
Yeah, I think that there were, the industry refers to, and it's kind of sad that this is the case, but the industry refers to 2 dates that happened in California as mass extinction events. One being January 1st, when folks needed to have a license, and of course everyone didn't get a license on January 1st, so a lot of businesses weren't able to operate. And then July 1st, when we had the mandatory testing requirement come on board. And what we saw happen was somewhat of a shortage issue. The day before, weeks before the testing requirement came on board, we saw cannabis being sold out the door, $5 an eighth. Just kind of ridiculous prices, because folks knew that the very next day or the very next week, they weren't going to be able to sell those products anymore. What it meant was July 1st and July 2nd, there were considerably less products on the shelves, but because there were operators who were licensed, folks were able to get their products from somewhere. What we've had an issue of in the city of Los Angeles is because we licensed a bunch of we authorized a bunch of retailers first and didn't license our supply chain, is that we've essentially forced our operators to buy supply from other cities and municipalities, but there hasn't been a shortage of products on the shelves. They're just not local products, and so we're hoping to be able to change that.
It took maybe 2 months for the market to kind of correct itself, and it hasn't fully corrected. I mean, after that July 1, when products had to be tested, a whole bunch of products went away and have yet to come back. I think that market will correct itself over time, though.
Okay, next question.
Hi, thanks for being here. My name is Melinda Katinger. I'm from the industry in Colorado. And my question revolves around environmental sustainability and how your different municipalities are dealing with issues such as best growing practices, cannabis waste specifically, and plastic recycling. There's been we've had some issues here of, well, can you recycle a plastic dram because it might have resin in it, and is that okay? Things like that. Thanks.
You would like to take that?
Okay. Well, in the city of Las Vegas, you can actually go to our website. We have an environmental officer that wrote up an environmental plan that anytime you open up a marijuana establishment in the city, you have to follow specific standards. And one of the standards is an environmental plan. And she did a lot of research and did a lot of back and forth and came up with this plan that everyone has to sort of follow. We don't have anything on the way of recycling, though, although I think that's a great idea to kind of go back and follow up with. But there is specifics on there on how to deal with the waste. They don't want you to just, throw it into the trash can and somebody can go dumpster diving and take it out. So there's like I think it's like 50-50 grinding method. She does talk about composting and stuff, but if you go to our website, lasvegasnevada.gov, and go to our marijuana page, there is that write-up on there.
Anyone else?
This is an area that I don't think that we're doing very well in the city of Los Angeles, and so I'm interested as we move forward into the next calendar year for us to figure out what this looks like. A lot of our regulations, as they involve environmental sustainability, are really coming from state agencies. This is an area that we really haven't done a deep dive into. So if there are folks who have suggestions, we're open for those suggestions.
So in Denver, we have a sustainability work group that is really sort of organized and run by the Office of the Denver Department of Environmental Health. They'll be speaking at this conference. And then what we sort of have led it and impaneled it, but it's a bunch of industry people. And they've got, I think, 3 pillars. They've done a lot of great work. They've got green business advising. It's purely advising type best practices stuff. And I think they released a best practices book about a couple of years ago, but I think they're about to update that and release another one, so there should be some good information in there. Okay.
Hi, thanks for being here. My name is Alex Rubin. I'm the compliance officer with Craft Concentrates, a cannabis manufacturing company in Colorado. My question is regarding state, local, and municipal regulations on micro stands for security, alarm permit usage, and monitoring of businesses from retail, manufacturing, and grows as well. One of the things that the industry is having a hard time with is regulations that come up on a municipal end and a state level, and trying to dictate one or the other or both when new regulations come up. My question is what's the best way to go about mimicking either state law or municipal law when a new regulation comes up that might cost parts of the industry hundreds of thousands of dollars for a new security, new alarm system, certain permits that you might have for those businesses, and how to mimic either state law or city law with those regulations?
I think to the extent that the industry can identify exactly where those differences are between state and local law and pose the question to regulators, does this difference make sense? I think that that's helpful for us. Part of the challenge, though, is that as Brandon was saying previously, we can't do anything or create laws at a local level that go against what the state says, but I think that most of us have this expectation that we're going to have local control over what we do. So unfortunately for the industry, what that means is, though, if your mother told you that you could go to the store and your father told you that you couldn't, that means you can't go. And so folks are trying to figure out what that means, and sometimes that's what that means.
Yeah, and I guess I would also add, at the kind of micro level of this, there are standards that exist that local governments, can look to and lean on. All of our security plans need to be approved by someone who's qualified to write it, and we have a standard that to be a security professional. And all of the equipment that they install as part of that approved plan needs to be UL certified. There's other, kind of listing agencies out there, like there's ISO for labs. So there are existing kind of standards out there that are already not even industry best practice, but just best practices as a whole for things like security.
Great. So we have about 2 more minutes. Do we have any more questions? Are you guys ready to break for lunch? Oops, we have one more. Come on up.
Hi. So my name is Julianne, and my question revolves around the transition from medical marijuana to recreational. And specifically I'm from the state of Connecticut, a state that has a robust medical program. How did you see that cannibalized with the conversion to recreational, specifically with the number of patients or with producers or dispensaries transitioning to solely recreational due to the fact primarily that it is a less expensive product to be able to produce?
So For us, again, super lucky, in that the way that our ballot initiative was written, it only allowed for the first 18 months those who already had a medical marijuana establishment license to get the recreational license. So really, everyone who's gone through that program and was licensed were the only ones allowed, and are still the only ones allowed to hold the recreational license. That finally expires mid-November, so this month. And so we'll see how the new recreational people kind of come on and how that changes for us. But for us, it was a smooth transition.
And I think for us, the requirement to get a medical card that bar was so low already. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was, 18 and have a pulse and, a sore elbow. And so you could get the card. And so what we've seen is most people are just kind of dropping their card. And really the people that are utilizing that medical card are people that have legitimate medical issues and they want to buy those different products that are available that have higher dosages to them, or are between the ages of 18 and 20 with a pulse and a sore elbow.
Anyone else?
In terms of the market itself, most of our medical folks did transition over and got every single license type, authorization type that they could for our adult use market. The one frustration that I have heard from medical patients, whether they're buying cannabis on the medical side or on the adult use side, is that because of taxes, new taxes are imposed. Mm-hmm. Folks are very concerned that they're not going to be able to continue with their same type of medical regimen because of the taxes that are new.
Can we just, I know we're out of time, but that's actually a very important topic, and we didn't really get on it, is taxation. In January 1st, a whole bunch of taxes went into place, and the number one person that we had a huge demographic leave the legal dispensary market in Sacramento, and they started buying in the illicit market because their cannabis was now 37% more expensive by the time you layer on all of the taxes.
And we will have a breakout session on that, so we can cover that then.
15 seconds. Oregon allowed medical dispensaries to sell a limited amount of recreational marijuana during that transition, and like Denver, Portland allowed medical dispensaries to get first bite at the apple to get licensed. So that's how we approached it.
Okay, great. All right, everyone, it's time for lunch. Thanks for being here, and thanks our panel. What a great panel.